Okay, so you're working with Microsoft Entra ID, and you're trying to wrap your head around applications. Like, how do they actually work in Entra ID?
Yeah,
Like,
applications can be a little tricky to understand in Entra ID.
right. So in this deep dive, we're going to untangle the connections between application registrations, application objects, and service principal objects.
Those are some pretty fundamental concepts to understand when you're working with applications in Entra ID.
Absolutely. And we're going to break it down by pulling straight from the Microsoft documentation so we can make these concepts super clear and understandable. Basically, by the end of this, you'll know what each one is, how they relate to each other, and why it's important to know the difference between them. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, so let's dive in. First stop, application registration. What is that all about?
So application registration is like the starting point. It's how you introduce your application to Entra ID.
Okay, so it's like the app's formal debut in the Entra ID world.
Yeah, exactly. The Microsoft documentation calls it creating an identity configuration for your application.
So it's basically like formally introducing your application to Entra ID so it can play nice with everything else in the tenant.
Yeah, and during registration, you also make a few important decisions about your app, like will it be single tenant or multi-tenant?
Right, so single tenant means the app can only be used within your own organization's Entra ID tenant. Multi-tenant means that users from other organizations can also use the app if they're granted access.
Exactly. And you can also specify a redirect URI, which is essentially where Entra ID sends users back to after they've authenticated.
Okay, so registration sets the stage for the app's identity within Entra ID. And once that's done, we get the application object.
All right, the application object is basically a globally unique instance of the app. It gets created in your home tenant, which is the tenant where you registered the application.
And each application object has a globally unique ID, the app ID or the client ID. So this application object is like the official record of the application in Entra ID.
Yeah, it's like the central definition of your application within its home tenant.
Yeah.
You can actually think of it as a blueprint.
A blueprint.
Yeah, the Microsoft documentation uses that analogy, like a class in object-oriented programming. The application object holds all the core characteristics of your application, like how it gets security tokens, what resources it needs access to, and what actions it's allowed to perform.
So it's more than just a static record. It's like the master plan for how the app interacts with Entra ID.
Exactly. And this blueprint helps Microsoft manage and update things without disrupting each tenant's specific setup.
That makes a lot of sense. And we can manage this blueprint, right? Through the app registrations page in the Entra Admin Center.
Yeah, that's the control panel for your app's identity.
Yeah.
You can manage secret certificates, permissions, branding for sign-in, all that stuff.
So registering an application creates both an application object and a service principal object in the home tenant.
Usually, yes. For most applications, it happens automatically.
Hmm.
But there can be exceptions, like when using the Microsoft Graph APIs to create applications. In those cases, creating the service principal object can be a separate step.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have the application object, which is the global blueprint. Now, what about these service principal objects? The documentation mentions that they are security principles. What does that even mean?
A security principle is basically any identity that can be given permissions to access resources protected by Entra ID. That could be a user, a group, or in this case, an application.
Okay, so the service principal represents the application when it's acting within a specific tenant.
Exactly. It's like the local representative of the application within a particular tenant. It defines the app's access policies and permissions within that tenant so it can authenticate and do its thing.
So if the application object is the global blueprint, the service principal is like the localized version of that blueprint that works within a specific organization's environment.
Exactly.
And there are different types of service principals, right? The documentation mentions application managed identity and legacy.
That's right.
Let's start with application service principals. They seem to be the ones most closely tied to our application object.
Yeah, so an application service principal is the local representation of a global application object in a single tenant. It basically takes a lot of its properties from the application object.
So it inherits characteristics from the global blueprint.
Yeah, and here's the important part. A service principal of this type is created in every tenant where the application needs to be used. It's not just in the home tenant.
Oh, okay. So if you have a multi-tenant application designed to be used by multiple organizations, each organization's Entra ID tenant would have its own separate service principal for that application.
Exactly. Each tenant needs its own service principal to define what the app can do within that specific tenant, which users can access it, and what resources it can access.
That makes sense. So each tenant has its own localized version of the application with its own set of permissions.
Right. And those permissions are usually granted when the application is registered or when an administrator or sometimes even a user consents to the application accessing resources.
And when those permissions are granted, that's usually when the service principal is created in that tenant.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about managed identity service principals. These seem a bit different.
Yeah, managed identities are designed to make things easier for developers when it comes to managing credentials.
Like passwords and certificates.
Yeah, instead of embedding sensitive credentials in their code, developers can assign a managed identity to an Azure service.
Okay, so it's like giving an Azure service its own identity within Entra ID without needing the developer to handle all the passwords and stuff.
Exactly. When you enable a managed identity for an Azure resource, like a virtual machine or an Azure function, Entra ID automatically creates a service principal in your tenant to represent that managed identity.
And these managed identity service principals don't have a corresponding application object, right?
Right. They're directly managed by Azure. You can give them permissions to access resources, but you can't directly change their properties.
Got it. So it's all handled behind the scenes by Azure.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about legacy service principals? Are those just older versions of service principals?
Pretty much. They represent applications created before application registration was a thing, or through older systems.
Ah, okay, so they're holdovers from the past.
Yeah, you can edit some of their properties like credentials and reply URLs, but they don't have a connection to an application registration.
So no global blueprint.
Right, and that means they can only be used in the tenant where they were created.
So they're stuck in their own little world.
Exactly.
So as an administrator, if I want to find and manage all these different service principals in my tenant, where do I go in the Entra Admin Center?
You'll find them all listed under enterprise applications. It doesn't matter what type of service principal they are, they'll all be there.
Okay, cool. So you can see permissions, sign-in logs, and do all sorts of management tasks from there.
Exactly.
Okay, so we know what application objects and service principals are and the different types of service principals. Now let's really dig into how these two things are connected. The documentation says that application objects are global, while service principals are local to a tenant.
That's the key difference. The application object in the home tenant is like the central source of truth, the master template. When a service principal is created in any tenant, it inherits properties from this application object.
So the service principal takes its basic characteristics from the global blueprint.
Yeah, like using a mold to create multiple copies.
Yeah.
Each copy might have its own variations, but they all share the basic shape of the mold.
That's a good analogy. And this isn't a one-to-one relationship, right? One application object can have many service principals.
Exactly. It's a one-to-many relationship. One application object can have corresponding service principal objects in many different tenants.
One in the home tenant and then potentially one in every other tenant where someone has consented to use the application.
Exactly. Each tenant needs a service principal, so the app can work properly within that environment, whether it's signing in users or accessing resources.
So for single tenant applications, you'll generally just have one service principal in the home tenant. But for multi-tenant applications, you could have many service principals spread across different tenants.
Exactly. The local service principal is what allows the application to operate within the specific rules and permissions of that tenant.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, if I want to see which service principals are associated with an app I've registered, how do I do that?
There are a couple of ways. In the Entra Admin Center, you can go to the app registration overview and look for something like Managed Application in Local Directory. That'll show you the service principal in your current tenant for that app.
And what if I prefer using command line tools?
You can use Microsoft Graph PowerShell. The command is getmg service principal -filter apid apid. Just replace apid with the actual app ID. Or if you're using the Azure CLI, the command is as adsip list filter apid apid.
Awesome. Okay, so what happens if you change the application object itself or even accidentally delete it? What are the consequences?
So if you make changes to the application object, those changes will automatically be reflected in the service principal in the home tenant.
That makes sense.
But those changes won't automatically affect the service principals in other tenants.
Oh, okay. So changing the global blueprint doesn't automatically change all the local copies.
Right. Each tenant's service principal is kind of independent based on the permissions that were granted in that tenant.
That makes sense from a security perspective. You wouldn't want changes in one tenant to accidentally mess things up in another tenant.
Exactly. Each organization needs to control what the app can do within their own environment.
So what if you delete the entire application object from the home tenant?
Deleting the app object will also delete the service principal object in the home tenant.
Okay, that's to be expected. But what if you restore the app object? Does that restore the service principal too?
No, unfortunately not. If you restore the application object, you have to manually recreate the service principal in the home tenant.
Oh, wow, that's important to know. Deleting the blueprint doesn't just delete the local copy in the home tenant, it also makes it harder to bring that local copy back.
Exactly. You have to be careful when managing these objects.
The documentation has this example of a multi-tenant HR app used by 3 companies, Datum, who developed the app, and then Contoso and Fabricum, who are using it. Can we walk through that example to see how this all works in a real-world scenario?
Sure. So a Datum, the developer, creates the HR app and registers it in their Entra ID tenant. That creates the global application object and a service principal object in a Datum's tenant.
Okay, so the app is now set up in a Datum's environment. What happens when Contoso and Fabricum want to start using the app?
When administrators from Contoso and Fabricum decide to use the app, they go through a consent process.
So they have to grant permission for the app to access resources in their tenants.
Right. The consent process outlines what permissions the app needs, and once the administrators give their consent, a service principal object for the HR app is created in their tenants.
So now Contoso and Fabricum each have their own service principal for the same HR app.
Exactly. And those service principals are configured with the specific permissions that their administrators granted.
So each company has its own localized version of the app with its own set of permissions.
Exactly. It's like they each have their own customized instance of the app running in their own environment.
And that's all managed through the service principals.
Right. A Datum, the developer, manages the single global application object, but Contoso and Fabricum manage their own service principal objects based on what they've consented to.
That's a great example. So just to recap, we start with application registration, which gives us the global application object, the blueprint. Then for the app to actually work within a tenant, including the home tenant, we need a service principal object.
Where the service principal is the local instance of the app. It inherits properties from the global app object, and it controls what the app can do in that tenant.
And for multi-tenant apps, there will usually be a separate service principal in every tenant where the app is being used.
Exactly.
So understanding this relationship between application objects and service principals is crucial for managing applications in Entra ID.
Absolutely. It helps you understand permissions, troubleshoot access issues, and just generally understand how security works in Azure.
So whether you're dealing with app permissions, trying to figure out access issues, or just want to learn more about cloud security, we hope this deep dive has cleared things up a bit.
And this isn't just theoretical knowledge. Understanding this stuff has real-world implications for how you work with applications in Entra ID. It helps you think more strategically about identity access control and authorization.
So here's something to think about. We've talked about the global application object and the tenant-specific service principals. How does this blueprint and instance model help balance global consistency with local control in a multi-tenant cloud environment? What are the security and management implications of this type of design? We encourage you to consider how these concepts apply to the situations you encounter in your own work.
And with that thought, keep exploring and keep learning. We'll see you in the next deep dive.